Blind Elephant, page 113. Quoting Bitson, the central thesis of the theory of logical types is that there is a discontinuity between a class and its members. The class cannot be a member of itself, nor can a member be the class. Since the term used for the class is of a different level of abstraction, a different logical type from terms used for its members, a different logical type from terms used for its members. In the 1980s, I adopted the ideas of Russell and Bitson to formulate the notion of logical levels and neurological levels in human behavior and change. Drawing from Bateson, the levels of model proposes that there is a natural hierarchy of levels within an individual or group that function as different logical types of processes. Since Russell's theory of types is based on class inclusion, this is a clear statement that class inclusion is the basis for both Dill's logical levels and neurological levels, despite his puzzling insistence that it is not. Dill's neurological levels hierarchy is as follows: spiritual, identity, beliefs and values, capabilities, behaviors, environment. I want to begin by saying that this can be very useful schema to focus our attention while gathering information. Sometimes a client has a problem that is mostly environmental. I live in a red hall. Sometimes they need to learn a particular behavior, spelling or small talk. Sometimes they may doubt their capability, learning or intelligence. Others may be confused about their beliefs or values. I don't know what to think, may suffer from an identity crisis. I don't know who I am, or may be troubled by spiritual doubts. Starting at the bottom, it can be very useful to divide our world of experience into behaviors and the environment in which those behaviors occur. This separates our entire scope of experience into two parts in which behaviors occur within the environment, an example of nested scope inclusion. Behavior inside environment. On the other hand, capabilities can be thought of as a category whose members are different behaviors. An example of class inclusion. On the other hand, capabilities can be thought of as a category whose members are different behaviors. Can be thought of as a whose members are different behaviors. An example of class inclusion. Identity, which consists of beliefs about the self, is placed above beliefs and values, which are both categories. However, identity consists of the beliefs that we have about ourselves, so it is a smaller included subcategory of beliefs. Furthermore, our identity includes our beliefs, values, capabilities, and behaviors, and even environment. I know I can learn fast. I love to ski, and I'm Westerner. Furthermore, our identity includes our beliefs, values, capabilities and behaviors, and even environment. I know I can learn fast. I love to ski, and I'm Westerner. And identity also certainly includes any spiritual beliefs that someone might have. Likewise, people value aspects of all 6 categories, including the process of valuing itself, and a truly spiritual person will say that they find spiritually in all 6 categories. They find spirituality in all 6 categories. A simple hierarchy, whether based on logical inclusion or scope inclusion, is inadequate to describe the complexity of our lives. At the very least, Diehl's neurological levels model should be modified into a fractal model, which could show that each category includes aspects of all the other categories. To summarize, Diehl's list of neurological levels sometimes uses scope inclusion, sometimes uses class inclusion, sometimes places subcategories above categories, and does not account for all the data. Now let's look at Michael Hall's description of this metastating process. In soul layering state upon state, the first state relates as a member of a class to the class itself. A logical level system refers to a system of layers of thoughts and emotions about thoughts and emotions, so that the higher layers classify or categorize the lower. A logical level system refers to a system of layers of thoughts and emotions about thoughts and emotions, so that the higher layers classify or categorize the lower. The first state relates as a member of a class to the class itself, and the higher layers classify or categorize the lower are both statements that describe class inclusion. Despite Hall's vigorous denial, however, the first state relates as a member of class to the class itself. The first state relates as a member of class to the class itself, and the higher layers classify or categorize the lower are both statements, and the first state relates as member of a class to itself, and the higher layer classify or categorize the lower are both statements that describe class inclusion, despite Hall's vigorous denial. However, these two descriptions are actually contradictory, because Hall describes the first state as being a higher layer. The first quote says that the first state is included as a member of the second, while the second quote says the reverse, that the first state classifies and includes the second. Here is another statement by Hall. Each layering of neuro-linguistic states not only textures the first state, but creates an entire neurosemantic network of embedded frames, a logical level system. By transcending or going meta to the first state, the meta state includes the previous state. Transcending or going meta is apparently a statement about class inclusion, while the meta state includes the previous state, does not specify whether this is class inclusion or scope inclusion. In addition, there are so many undefined nominalizations, neuro-linguistic states, neurosemantic network, logical level system, transcending, going meta. In addition, there are so many undefined nominalizations and metaphors, layering, textures, embedded frames in this writing that it is impossible to know what he is describing. Let's examine another description of metastating by Hall. This is the beauty of metastating. When we bring one state to bear upon another and apply one to another, the higher state functions as a contextual meaning of or frame for the lower. Playful seriousness, playful and compassionately kind seriousness, playful, compassionately kind and win-win thinking for the long-term seriousness. Playful seriousness is a subcategory of seriousness, an example of class inclusion. Playful and compassionately kind seriousness is a subcategory of playful seriousness. Playful, compassionately kind, and win-win thinking for the long-term seriousness is an even smaller subcategory of playful and compassionately kind seriousness. This is inconsistent with Hall's previous description that the first higher state, playful, includes the second one, seriousness. In addition, win-win thinking for the long term introduces two expansions of scope, one in space and one in time. Win-win means that someone else's outcome is included in what is described, and long-term extends the scope and time. Scope inclusion and class inclusion are not distinguished throughout Hall's writing. The following is another description of thinking and Hall's meta-stating process. When it comes to how our minds operate in thinking and feeling, you can count on something else. You can count on these being non-linear processes. They don't go in straight lines. Thoughts go in circles, spirals, backwards, inside out, and more. To learn metastates necessitates a different kind of thinking than you're probably used to. I will try to keep it as straightforward and linear as possible, but your mind will go in circles, spiral around, forward and backwards. You'll jump logical levels. You will layer your awareness with dozens of resources and limitations. That is simply the way mind works. You will probably get lost in these processes. You are supposed to get lost. You will get dizzy and confused. Well, I admit to being dizzy and confused. What on earth could it mean for thoughts or mind to go backwards or inside out? Many years ago, someone said, all writing is either biography or autobiography. In this case, I think it is definitely autobiography. Without a clear operational definition for a distinction or description, it is impossible to test any statement of logical levels for internal consistency, and it is also impossible to determine its usefulness in describing real-world events of thinking and communication. Until Dietz or Hall provide a clear operational definition of how they determine logical levels, I can only comment out of my own understanding of scope and category. Let's explore a common event in therapy, understanding it by using my definition of logical levels based on categorical inclusion. Let's explore a common event in therapy. Understanding it by using my definition of logical levels based on categorical inclusion. Logical level confusion. In everyday conversation, people exchange messages at different logical levels. In everyday conversation, people exchange messages at different logical levels, and often this is entirely appropriate. I say that I enjoyed a good meal, and my wife responds with, "I'm glad," including my experience in a more general category of things that she is glad about. She asks me, "How was the seminar?" asking for an overall evaluation, and I respond at more specific level by telling her about one of the events that I enjoyed, a scope rather than a categorization. At other times, a response at a different logical level is not so useful. For instance, if someone asks me how to get to a particular restaurant, and I respond by raving about the wonderful food at that restaurant, that doesn't tell them what they need to know. If I ask someone what they thought of a movie, and they respond, "I liked it," that is not an answer to my question. Since people's problems exist at different logical levels, it is important to be able to track levels and respond at the appropriate level in order to offer something that they can make use of. If someone feels terrible because they don't know how to drive a car, it is usually much more useful to teach them that skill than it is to make them feel better about not being able to. If someone feels terrible because they don't know how to drive a car, it is usually much more useful to teach them that skill than it is to make them feel better about not being able to. On the other hand, if someone is handicapped and physically unable to drive a car, then it is appropriate to change how they think about this limitation. Often, a great deal of therapeutic effort is devoted to changing the feelings that someone has in response to a problem. It is usually much more useful to change the situation or their perception of the situation so that it is no longer a problem for them. And then their feelings automatically become more positive. Now, let's examine another common situation that is a little more complex. Disbelief in the possibility of change. In a change work session, often a client will say something like, "I don't think it will work," a statement about the process, which is an apparent objection to going forward with the process. Disbelief is a more general category, a higher logical level than process itself, since disbelief includes all the other things that the client doesn't believe in. Many therapists mistakenly think that they have to change this disbelief about a process before they can proceed with the process itself. The therapist's belief is about client's belief, so it is an even more general level than client's belief about the process. At this point, they have both become completely distracted from the process that can be used to solve the problem. This is an example of how both client and therapist can lose track of the logical levels in communication and waste a lot of time on irrelevant issues. Belief in the process would only be necessary if you were doing faith healing, in which the healer or guru has so little confidence in their own methods and skills that they think that they need the client's belief in order to bring about change. At this point, the real issue is not the client. It's not the client's doubt that the process will work, but the therapist's doubt that their process will work even though the client doesn't believe in it. This situation betrays a common and fundamental confusion between faith healing, which relies on belief, and science, the study of what works no matter what someone believes, two entirely different categories. When you know that a process will work, it is not important whether or not anyone believes that it will work, any more than it is necessary to believe in a cell phone in order to use it. It is only important that the client is willing to cooperate in doing the process, so that you and he can find out if it works or not. A very striking example of this appears in my 21-year-old video of the fast phobia cure, which is also available in transcript from 4, chapter 7. After I conclude the 7-minute session and say, "That's all there is to it," the woman expresses her disbelief by laughing hysterically for 8 seconds. Then she says emphatically, "I'm glad I didn't pay for this," and continues to laugh hysterically for another 20 seconds. If that doesn't sound very long to you, pause, look at your watch, and try laughing out loud for 28 seconds. Even though her conscious mind was completely unbelieving and skeptical, she was very cooperative, and the process worked. And I now have 19 years of follow-up. When you have confidence in your methods and skills, cooperation is all you need. With this understanding, your response to a doubting client will be focused only on eliciting their cooperation, not their belief. You can simply bypass their belief and redirect attention to what they want, a more specific category, in order to gain cooperation in doing the process. For instance, you can say, "You think some of the ideas and methods that I use sound really weird and crazy, and you don't think they could be of any use to you. However, I don't care whether you think it will work or not, because I'm not a faith healer, and I know that it will work. The theories of physics and electricity that were used to make your cell phone are also pretty crazy, but they work. And when you use your cell phone to call someone, it is completely irrelevant whether or not you believe that it will work." This makes a clear distinction between the categories of faith healing and science, and between a theory and results of using a theory. I also know you are really hurting in this situation, and you don't want to have those horrible consequences and bad feelings that you have been having. You'd really like to have much more resourceful ways of responding. Besides matching their experience, this refocuses their attention on the problem, which is either a scope or more specific category, at a low logical level. This also elicits away from motivation and then directs their attention to their positive outcome, also giving them something to move forward toward. Now, the really important question is this. If my crazy method did work, and you got the outcome we have been discussing, would you have any objection to actually being that way? I want you to vividly imagine that it is now tomorrow, and you have already achieved the outcome you want. I want you to take some time to explore very thoroughly how well this new way of being and responding works for you, now and in the days and weeks to come. What is it like to have these new responses? How do your family, friends, boss, subordinates, and strangers respond to you in all the different major contexts in which you live, home, work, play, etc.? Because we might find that we need to adjust your new response to be sure it works well in all aspects of your life before we go through a process that will create this new ability in you. This ecology check, which is really a congruency check, asks the client to expand their scope and create a series of sensory-based scenarios in which they enact their desired responses and notice how satisfied they are with the results. The results of a carrying out these scenarios will be used as a feedback to adjust the outcome until it is satisfactory. Often this rehearsal is all that is needed to elicit and contextualize the new responses, and they may never have to go through the process that they originally thought was crazy. This ecology check, which is really a congruence check, asks the client to expand their scope and create a series of sensory-based scenarios in which they enact their desired responses and notice how satisfied they are with the results. The results of carrying out these scenarios will be used as feedback to adjust the outcome until it is satisfactory. Often this rehearsal is all that is needed to elicit and contextualize the new responses, and they may never have to go through the process that they originally thought was crazy. However, let's assume that you do need to do another process, and a client has objections to cooperating. You simply have to find a category that is acceptable to them and show how the crazy process fits into this category. For instance, one colleague was working with a religious man who objected to visualization because he thought it was New Age and contrary to his religion. The colleague first asked the client about a number of examples of planning for the future, in which the client agreed that visualization was useful. Then he recategorized the visual wish pattern as being a different kind of auditory or written prayer, a special form of prayer in the visual modality. Of course, the foregoing assumes that there is a process that will work dependably for the client's problem or outcome, and that you know what it is. Whenever an intervention doesn't work, I assume that either I made a mistake in eliciting the structure of the problem, so the process I choose was inappropriate, or the client did not do the process appropriately, usually because my instructions were clumsy or ambiguous, and/or the client made a creative interpretation of them, or the problem is a special case with a somewhat different or more complex structure than usual, something that I can determine and use to adjust the process accordingly. When an intervention works for a while and then stops working, I assume that the intervention was basically appropriate, but that it interfered with some other outcome. This other outcome is often called secondary gain in psychology, but it really should be called primary gain, since the client thinks it is more important than the initial desired outcome. In this case, the intervention needs to be adjusted or changed so that it doesn't interfere with the secondary gain. For instance, one of our students cured a woman's phobia of spiders, and she was fine for a couple weeks, but then her phobia returned. Upon investigation, the phobia had a positive function. It was a dependable way to get her husband's attention when other ways failed. Another way of describing this is that her phobic response was an example of the category ways to dependably get husband's attention, a category that had no other members. When she learned that and tested alternative dependable ways to get her husband's attention, the phobia resolution process lasted. Logical levels are simply ways to track how someone uses categorical inclusion or to organize their experience. Which experiences are included in which categories, and which categories are included in other categories. When you understand the logical structure of someone's thinking, you can use this to determine when it is inappropriate and change the structure. When someone's thinking leads them into blind alleys, endless circling, or other confusion, you can help them find their way out of the maze. Summary. Whenever we think and communicate, the words we use sometimes refer directly to a specific scope of sensory-based experience, such as that thing right there, non-verbally pointing to it, or the house at 112 Elm Street, or the name of a specific person, Bill Sanderson. However, almost all the words we use refer to categories rather than to specific experiences. In the example above, thin, house, elm, and street name more abstract categories of experience until and unless they are further specified. When we group categories into a more general category or subdivide a category into more specific ones, that category's logical levels of categorization. When we group categories into a more general category or subdivide a category into more specific ones, that creates logical levels of categorization. The more general categories are said to be at a higher logical level than the included ones, which are at a lower level. Any creation, property, or quality used to create a category also applies to any more specific included category.